It could, and it wouldn't bring up mud out of the bowels of the earth, which you have to have at the same time. If it split the earth, if it got the continents to start splitting, yeah, because the continents split, and when they moved apart, all this stuff came up out of the earth, rock and sand and mud and clay and salt and all kinds of liquids, different kinds of waters, and that flowed up on the land and buried all these things. At the same time, if you split the earth with an asteroid, or if God just hit the earth with his fist, I don't know, it got the earth splitting. If you split the earth, today, if the ground shifts a couple of feet up in Alaska, it just wrecks everything. And that's a nothing event. But if you separate the ground by 100 feet or 1,000 feet or a mile, think of what it's going to do. It's going to cause all the mud on the bottom of the oceans to start moving. Earthquakes in New York back in the 20s were recorded to send a 2-foot thick layer of mud at 65 miles an hour for 50 miles. Well, this is telling how many crabs got buried in that stuff. It's only 2 feet thick, so some of them could work their way up. But if you magnify that by 10,000 times, you would have all the mud on the ocean start moving. It's going to bury all the bottom-dwelling creatures, a lot of the fish. It's going to change the chemistry of the water. It's going to change the temperature of the water. And a lot of things are going to die and get buried. That's what you see. And up on the land up here, in Japan, sometimes they'll have earthquakes and buildings sink into the dirt. And people will sink into the dry dirt because it's being liquefied. It's being vibrated. So it loosens up and things drop out down into it. Sometimes they come up out of it. That's what you see all around South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Canada, is liquefaction. And the land animals they're burying up in these sediments, and pretty soon they suffocate or die from exposure, die from trying to fight the mud, and they get buried. People don't realize how many dinosaurs are out there. They're not rare. Good grief, there are more dead dinosaurs than living cattle. There's a friend of mine has a site up there in South Dakota. The layer, just one layer, is 3 feet thick. It's under about 65 feet of sediments, but it's a 3-foot thick layer of hadrosaur bones with carnivore animals mixed in there with it, and they're all dismembered. There's no articulation, but they're in great shape. And that layer goes for miles. It's just one layer. There are places where there are 10,000 of one species of dinosaur buried together. One species. In Canada, they got a site up there where I call them the stump horn triceratops are buried for 50 miles. These things are buried. They have this big stump on the end of their nose, not a horn. And what buried them? Well, it couldn't be a local creek. Can't be a river getting out of its banks. It's too vast. And the layers are too thick. There's hundreds of feet of layers. So if you split the continents by whatever means, you're going to move the ocean mud and kill everything, and you're going to cause the land to start vibrating and slide and bury everything on top of the land. That's what you find. And that solves the problem of millions of years needing to go by between the layers. If that was true, there'd never be a fossil formed. Because I've got bones out here in the dry desert of Texas. In 10 years, they're falling to staves. They look like crackers that have been stepped on. Okay? So dinosaurs never got a chance to lay on the ground for thousands of years and finally get covered up by the dust in the swamps. Please. It just didn't happen. That's not the way it happened. They didn't die by falling over into a creek, and then the next little flood comes in and buries part of them, and 1,000 years later, the next part gets buried. That's just nonsense. In South Dakota, Wyoming, we're digging in Wyoming, down one of the next ranches over, they were taking out a triceratops with its skin on it. I asked one of my friends who was digging up, I said, so how do you figure that? Well, there was a flood, and he washed up on a sandbank and dried out in the sun like a camel. Like, well, give me a break. In the tropics, it's not going to dry out. He's going to putrefy and fall apart.
Yeah.
And the other scavenger will come in and he'll just dissolve. It's not going to be kept with his skin on. There's one called Willa up in, I think, South Dakota or North Dakota. A little, I think a thesalosaur maybe. It's got internal organs are preserved. There's a mummy in the Museum of Natural History in New York City taken out in the 1800s. Part of it is petrified, and the rest of it, it's the skin is there. It's dried up like stretched over the bones. There's no way, and it's upside down. There's no way that thing got buried laying out in the desert. He had to get buried in mud, which was anaerobic and didn't have the oxygen in there to rot the thing. So it laid there, buried up in all this mud with no oxygen, and just mummified. And that's all over the place. There's a lot of those. A friend of mine said, we were digging up a hadrosaur and kept throwing this layer of rock around it until somebody looked and said, "Oh my gosh, it's its skin."
Interesting.
So don't tell me those things been out there in the dirt for 65 million years and their skin is still there. I don't believe it.
Well, that tells me, because I was reading the report here a couple of weeks ago, that big asteroid that went over Russia and exploded, and they were lucky on that one. They didn't even know what happened to it happened. But I was reading an article of one bigger than that actually hit the ocean, for example. We'd be looking at where it would come in for miles and miles and miles into the land, these huge waves.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the mercy of God that hasn't happened. There's some pretty big asteroids out there, and that could happen, and I think it has in the past. I think that probably explains some of the burials that we have around the Earth. Earthquakes, volcanoes, and asteroid strikes probably explain a lot of the burials we see, or some of the formations of the Earth. There were bad happenings there, as one geologist told me. And we're having a hard time understanding. It's like a car wreck. You ever look at car wrecks, where cars have been hit really hard? You look at it and you're trying to imagine, what did this fender used to look like? And was it always back here behind the motor? How does this thing, if you looked at a car wreck, and you didn't know what kind of car it was, you'd have a hard time figuring out where those parts belong because they're out of place. And that's what happens in earthquakes. We just had a big, in Peru, they'll have these big mudslides. All of a sudden, the side of a mountain just breaks loose, and here it comes down, buries a whole village. And there they are, And I think that has been going on since the flood that covered the entire Earth. The Earth is still moving and cracking, and every now and then it lets go in the ocean. Here comes the tsunami, or it lets go up underneath the land mass, and up comes volcanoes and movement, liquefaction. This is a dangerous place to be for an animal.
Oh yeah, or a human actually in the future. But
they're human.
Yeah, like this article was talking about, that. For example, a big enough asteroid coming at the speed it comes, let's say it crashes in the ocean and near a fault line or a major fault. Then you can have set off volcanoes. You can set off, maybe that's what separated the continents. A big asteroid hitting a fault line, because the speed, it actually would go into the Earth a lot deeper than anybody ever, even I would imagine. Because they were talking, an asteroid coming at that speed could go in pretty deep into the mantle.
Yeah, something split the continents, because you look at the mid-oceanic rift. You can see where the land shifts. Up comes the volcanic stuff. It shifts again, and up it comes. There's always cracks. They're almost mechanical. They look mathematical. It splits and shifts, and forms this ridge out there. But it's kind of like the zipper between all the continents. And definitely something happened down there. We don't see it very much today unless we get a tsunami or something. But the Earth's still moving around, and it's not. Now we're going to get into some bad subjects here. I know I've talked to people about the global warming, global cooling, global everything deal. I've heard the scientists and the ecologists talk about it. I've read a lot of their papers. I've talked to geologists and other people. And meteorologists, to me, the consensus is, hey, folks, it's the sun. We can't control the sun. There are all these sunspots and activity on the sun that's not regular necessarily. We never know quite what's going to happen. And the sun is what controls the temperature of the earth. It's, I'm glad we cleaned up the air. Because if you lived in Chicago or over in London back 100 years ago, my gosh, you're breathing wood smoke or coal smoke all the time.
Well, don't go to mainland China, because I had a friend who went there a couple of years ago, and he said that the air was so toxic that he really, because he had asthma, and he said he could just barely breathe because of all the pollution just being dumped in the air.
Yeah, they're going to have to do something about it, and they're getting wealthy enough now with all the business we've given them and everybody else. They're going to have to do something about it, or they'll start to decline, and they're going to have to spend untold billions, maybe trillions, to fix the pollution over there. And they've got a water problem. They need to spend money on their water. I had one of my PhD friends went over there to a conference. He delivered a paper on one of our projects, and he came back. He says, "Man, what they need over there is water. They need clean water and sanitation. They're just out in the country, so they just don't have it." Well, they need to take some of that money they're making and put that into. It's not hard to clean water up. It's not hard to get water. It just takes some. We've got, good grief, the Chinese have got technology that's amazing. So if they'll apply it to their water and their pollution over there, they can fix it just like we did. I was in New York City in '67. I lived there. I felt sorry for the women because they all had to get on they at some point, no matter where they lived, they had to walk a couple blocks to get to their work, right? And they would come in with flakes of burned paper on their head, on their forehead. They had to go in the bathroom and clean up. Because back at that time, I lived in a building where my brother was a super, and it's my job to deal with the garbage. So there was an incinerator in all these old buildings in the 1800s. That's where you burn your trash. That's what we did with it. We burned it. And it went out in a big smokestack and went all over New York City. Well, they stopped all that, So now, back then, you couldn't see a block away in New York City. And now it's cleaned up. Same with L.A. I went out there in '69, and sometimes
smog.
You couldn't see 2 blocks down the road. It's just white smoke. So they came in and they gave everybody a ticket. If their car was smoking, if they need a valve or a ring job, they give you a ticket. Well, within about a year, everybody went out and got their cars fixed so they weren't burning so much oil, and the air cleared right up. Hey, it wasn't that hard. So all this global cooling, global warming, global change, and all that sort of stuff, we're doing something about a lot of it. We're working on it. Industry's not some ogre. Industry has as much interest in all this stuff as anybody else. They're just not personal. But we're fixing a lot of it.
Okay, Joe, we're going to have to go for a 2-minute break here, and I just got to warn you in about a minute and a half. But that is, I can remember back 40 years ago. I worked for a major bicycle company up in Kent, Washington, for a little short period of time. They had their bikes made in China because they quit making them here because the paint they use. The government, the EPA said, no, you can't use that paint. It's too toxic. Well, on a bicycle, they needed a paint. It was very durable. So that's how the bike started being made in China, because they had no laws that they can use this real toxic paint, which is very durable. But it just tells you about the pollution. It's so bad there. Anyway, we need to go on break. Joe, if you want to get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, we'll be back in about 2.5 minutes, and I'm going to put you on hold.
Very good.
Okay, sir.